Sunnyvale police have made an arrest in connection with a 1982 cold case homicide. 75-year-old Gary Ramirez was arrested at his home in Hawaii. He was taken into custody by Sunnyvale detectives, members of the Santa Clara County DA's office cold case unit, the FBI, and Maui police. Ramirez was wanted for the killing of 15-year-old Karen Stitt 40 years ago. Investigators say DNA found at that crime scene linked him to that crime. Ramirez is awaiting extradition back to California, where he's expected to face charges of first-degree murder with special circumstances.
She never made it to the bus stop. It was a Tuesday morning in Sunnyvale, California, September 1982. The air was still carrying that dry, golden warmth that the Bay Area holds on to just before autumn finally wins. The kind of morning where the sky is so perfectly blue it almost looks fake. Karen Stitt, 15 years old, dark hair, backpack over one shoulder, was walking a route she had walked before. A quiet stretch of sidewalk, the kind that feels safe because nothing has ever happened there. She had a boyfriend. She had a life ahead of her. She had no idea that within the next few minutes, the world she knew would end, and that it would take 40 years, a trash can in Hawaii, and a quiet breakthrough in forensic science before anyone would answer for what was about to happen to her. The police would find her body concealed behind a cinderblock wall, drenched in blood. The medical examiner's report would later reveal she had been sexually assaulted and stabbed 59 times. 59. That number doesn't process easily. It isn't a crime of impulse. It is a crime of sustained, deliberate violence, the kind that tells investigators something critical about the person who committed it. And yet, for 4 decades, that person walked free. He built a life. He moved to an island paradise. He apparently believed he had gotten away with it. He was wrong. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We've got viewers joining from all over the world, and we love knowing who's here with us tonight. To understand what was lost when Karen Stitt died, you have to understand what 1982 looked like for a 15-year-old girl in the South Bay. Silicon Valley was in its awkward adolescence. The word tech boom hadn't entered the vocabulary yet, but the energy was there, crackling underneath the surface. Sunnyvale and the surrounding communities were working-class neighborhoods, bumping up against the edges of something bigger. The streets were quiet in the mornings. Parents sent their kids to bus stops without a second thought. There were no cell phones to track location, no cameras on every corner, no digital footprint following you down the sidewalk. Karen lived in Palo Alto, just a short distance from Sunnyvale. By all accounts, she was a normal teenager doing normal things: school, a boyfriend, the particular busyness of being 15 when every week feels like its own small lifetime. She was not a statistic. She was a person in the middle of becoming who she was going to be. And on that September morning, someone took that from her before it even had a chance to happen. When investigators arrived at the scene, what they found was not random. The body had been moved and concealed. That takes time. That takes thought. Whoever did this was not panicking, or if they were panicking with enough control to take deliberate action. The cinderblock wall, the positioning, these details told detectives immediately that they were dealing with someone who understood, even in the chaos of the moment, that they needed to hide what they had done. That combination, extreme violence alongside calculated concealment, created a profile that would haunt this case for decades. The sexual assault evidence was collected. Biological material was preserved. In 1982, DNA profiling, as we understand it today, did not exist. The double helix had been understood for 30 years, but the science of using genetic markers to identify a specific human being from a crime scene sample, that was still years away from becoming reality. Investigators did what they could with what they had. They canvassed the neighborhood. They interviewed everyone connected to Karen's life. And almost immediately, attention turned somewhere that felt logical, somewhere that statistics and investigative experience pointed them, toward the people already closest to her. Karen's boyfriend became a person of interest. This is not unusual. In cases of violence against young women, intimate partners are always examined first, and for good reason. The numbers historically support that instinct. Investigators looked hard at him. For years, longer than anyone should have to live under that shadow, he existed in the gray space of unproven suspicion. Imagine carrying that. Imagine being a teenager who lost someone you cared about, then spending years being quietly regarded as a possible killer. The case went cold. The boyfriend grew older. The grief settled into something permanent and unresolved. The DNA profile sat in evidence storage, patient, waiting for science to catch up. Cold cases have a particular kind of gravity to them. They don't close, they calcify. The detectives who worked the original investigation retire or pass away. Witnesses move. Memories erode. Physical evidence degrades in ways that aren't always noticed until someone finally goes looking again. The Karen Stitt case followed this trajectory in the years after 1982. Sunnyvale police did not forget her. Her file didn't gather dust in the way some cases do. But forward progress required a tool that simply didn't exist yet. The first major turn came when DNA profiling became operational in law enforcement, a process that accelerated dramatically through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. Suddenly, that biological material collected at the scene had new potential. The sample from Karen's case was processed. A DNA profile was built. And here is where the case simultaneously advanced and hit a wall. The profile was strong, clean, the kind of genetic evidence that prosecutors dream about. But when investigators ran it through CODIS, the National DNA Database, nothing came back. No match. Whoever had attacked Karen Stitt had never had their DNA entered into the system. They had no qualifying criminal record. They were, in the language of law enforcement, a ghost. The boyfriend's name could finally be cleared. DNA confirmed he was not the source of the biological material found at the scene. Whatever suspicion had lingered around him for years was officially, scientifically dissolved. That was not nothing. That was the end of a decades-long wrongful shadow over an innocent person's life. But it still left the central question completely unanswered. If not him, then who? The case entered a new phase of waiting. And then the world of forensic science did something nobody in 1982 could have predicted. Genetic genealogy is not magic, though the first time you understand how it works, it feels close to it. The basic concept starts with the fact that most people understand in the abstract, but don't fully appreciate. Your DNA is shared in measurable degrees with your biological relatives. Not just parents and siblings, cousins, second cousins, distant relatives you have never met and may not even know exist. And in the 2010s, millions of ordinary people began voluntarily uploading their genetic data to consumer ancestry databases, hoping to find family connections, trace heritage, learn where their grandparents came from. They were also, without knowing it, building the most powerful investigative tool in the history of law enforcement. Here's how it works in practice. Investigators take a DNA profile from a crime scene. In this case, the profile built from the biological evidence at Karen Stitt's murder scene, and they run it through one of these consumer ancestry databases. What they are looking for is not an exact match. They are looking for partial matches. Cousins, third cousins, distant relatives who share a measurable percentage of genetic material with the unknown suspect. From those partial matches, forensic genealogists begin building a family tree. They work backward and forward through generations. They use public records, birth certificates, obituaries, census data, old newspaper clippings to construct a branching map of who is related to whom. This is painstaking, methodical, often tedious work. A single case can require months of genealogical research before a potential suspect family emerges. But when it works, and increasingly it works, it produces something that no other investigative tool can produce, a name that the evidence points toward, even when that person has never been in a criminal database. In Karen Stitt's case, investigators working with this technology eventually narrowed their focus to a family from Fresno, California. Not an individual, Not yet, but a family. Specifically, they identified that the crime scene DNA likely belonged to one of four brothers. For men, same bloodline, each one a potential answer to a 40-year-old question. The investigation had gone from a ghost to a short list. But a short list of four is not an arrest. To make this work, investigators needed one more thing. They needed to collect DNA from the suspects without tipping their hand. This is where cold case investigations enter their most delicate phase, the phase that requires patience that borders on painful. Detectives knew who they were looking at. They had narrowed a universe of billions of people down to four brothers. But they cannot simply walk up and demand a DNA sample. That requires probable cause. That requires a warrant. And at this stage of the investigation, what they had was statistical probability and genealogical inference. Powerful tools, but not yet legal tools. One wrong move, one conversation that spooked the wrong person, one news leak, one moment where the suspects realized they were being watched, and the entire investigation could collapse. So investigators did something that is now used in cold case work around the country, something that is legal and effective and profoundly clever. They waited, they watched, and they collected. When people throw things away, food containers, mail, coffee cups, cigarette butts, they abandon any legal expectation of privacy over those items. Investigators had identified that one of the brothers had a daughter, and that daughter could be located and observed. Without any contact, without any confrontation, detectives recovered items from her trash. Discarded items. Things she had thrown away without a second thought on an ordinary day. The way all of us throw things away without thinking. Those items contained her DNA. And her DNA, as the daughter of one of the four brothers, could be used to determine which brother matched the crime scene profile. The results came back. The sample from the daughter's discarded items provided the confirmation investigators had been building toward for years. The genetic trail led definitively to one man. His name was Gary Ramirez. Gary Ramirez was not in Fresno when investigators finally identified him. He was not in California at all. In the 40 years since Karen Stitt was murdered at a bus stop on a Golden Tuesday morning, Gary Ramirez had built a different life. He was living in Maui, Hawaii, one of the most beautiful places on earth, warm and green, surrounded by ocean, thousands of miles from the cinderblock wall in Sunnyvale. He had apparently believed for 4 decades that what he had done in 1982 had stayed in 1982, that the distance of years and miles had insulated him permanently. In 2022, law enforcement traveled to Maui. They arrested Gary Ramirez. The 40-year chapter of silence closed in a moment. Consider what that arrest ain't for a moment, because it is easy to rush past it. For 40 years, there was a man walking around free who had sexually assaulted and stabbed a 15-year-old girl 59 times. He had breathed ocean air and felt sun on his face and slept in his bed every night for 4 decades. And for 40 of those years, Karen Stitt's family had no answer. No justice, no closure, though that word barely scratches the surface of what families in these situations actually carry. The investigators who worked this case understood the weight of that gap. Cold case units are staffed by people who chose, specifically, to work on the hardest cases, the ones that broke the detectives before them, the ones that conventional methods couldn't crack. They are methodical in a way that looks almost serene from the outside, but which requires immense emotional discipline on the inside. When you're working a case this old, you are not just investigating a crime. You are holding a responsibility to a victim who can no longer speak for herself, and to a family that has been waiting longer than most people's careers. The forensic genealogy work in this case did not happen in isolation. It required coordination between the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office, Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety Detectives, and specialists who understand how to translate raw genetic data into a usable investigative lead. It required someone to make the call to pursue the trash DNA approach, a method that is legal but requires careful documentation to survive legal scrutiny. Every step of this investigation had to be done in a way that would hold up in a courtroom, because all the science in the world means nothing if a defense attorney can get the evidence thrown out on a procedural violation. That discipline paid off. When Gary Ramirez faced the legal system in 2025, he did not fight the evidence. He could not fight the evidence. The DNA was definitive. The forensic genealogy work that had led investigators to his family, the sample collected through his daughter, the direct match to the crime scene. It formed a chain of proof that left no legitimate avenue of contest. In 2025, Gary Ramirez pleaded no contest to first-degree murder. No contest means he did not admit guilt in the formal legal sense, but he accepted the conviction and its consequences without contesting the facts of the case. The distinction matters legally. It does not matter practically. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. He was in his 60s when that sentence was handed down. The mathematics of 25 years to life, for a man his age, means he will almost certainly die in custody. The man who walked away from a cinderblock wall in Sunnyvale in 1982, believing he had escaped everything, will end his life in a California prison. Take a moment with that. 40 years, one trash can, one daughter's discarded genetic material, one breakthrough in a science that didn't exist when the crime was committed. The entire trajectory of this case bends on those pivot points, and understanding those pivot points is not just about satisfying our need for resolution. It is about understanding how justice actually functions in the modern world and what that means for the thousands of cold cases that are still waiting. Because Karen Stitt's case is not unique in its resolution. It is increasingly representative of a new era in criminal justice. As of the mid-2020s, forensic genetic genealogy has been used to solve hundreds of cold cases across the United States. The technique was pioneered in high-profile fashion with the identification of the Golden State Killer in 2018, a case that demonstrated to law enforcement agencies nationwide that this tool could work, and could work on cases that had seemed permanently unsolvable. Since then, the methodology has been refined, the databases have grown, and the legal frameworks around its use have been tested and, in most jurisdictions, upheld. What this means in practical terms is that the concept of a perfect crime has been fundamentally altered. A killer who avoids leaving fingerprints, who is never entered into CODIs, who moves across the country and builds a new identity. That person may still be findable because their DNA lives not just in their own body, but in every biological relative who has ever uploaded a genetic sample to an ancestry website. The net is cast not over criminals, but over families, and every family member who participates in consumer genealogy becomes, inadvertently, a potential link in an investigative chain. This is not without ethical complexity. Forensic genealogy raises serious questions about genetic privacy, about the rights of people who never consented to be part of a criminal investigation, and yet whose DNA can be used to identify a relative as a suspect. These debates are ongoing. Some states have passed regulations limiting when and how investigative genealogy can be used. Civil liberties organizations have raised legitimate concerns about where the boundaries should be drawn. These conversations matter, and the fact that the technology produces justice in cases like Karen Stitt's does not automatically resolve the harder questions about how broadly it should be applied. But here, tonight, in this specific case, the technology did exactly what justice requires. It found the person responsible for the death of a 15-year-old girl. It cleared an innocent person who had lived under suspicion for years. It gave Karen Stitt's family an answer that they had waited 4 decades to receive. Whatever the ongoing debates about forensic genealogy may be, those outcomes are real and they are significant. So what do we learn from this? What did Karen Stitt's case actually teach us? Not as a true crime story, but as a lesson we can carry forward. The first lesson is about the durability of biological evidence. If you're a detective, a forensic specialist, a medical examiner, or anyone involved in the collection and preservation of evidence from a crime scene, This case is an argument for treating every sample as if the technology to fully exploit it is arriving next year. Because it might be. The investigators who collected biological evidence at Karen Stitt's murder scene in 1982 had no way of knowing that forensic genetic genealogy would exist. They could not have imagined codes or consumer DNA databases or the science that would make all of this possible. But they preserved the evidence with enough care that it remained viable 40 years later. That discipline, that professional seriousness about what evidence might someday mean, is what made the 2022 arrest possible. Evidence preservation is not a bureaucratic formality. It is a promise to future justice. The second lesson is about the nature of cold case work specifically. It requires institutional commitment that outlasts individual careers. The detectives who first responded to the scene where Karen was found are long retired. Some may have passed away. The people who ultimately broke this case were not the people who opened it. Cold case units are expensive. They require resources and staffing and the kind of long-term organizational patience that governments often find difficult to maintain. But Karen Stitt's case is the argument for why that investment matters. Justice delayed by 40 years is still justice. An answer delivered to a grieving family after decades is still an answer. Cold case units are not a luxury. They're a moral obligation. The third lesson is one for all of us, and it is perhaps the most important. The arc of forensic science bends toward accountability. If you committed a crime and believe that time has protected you, believe that because you evaded capture in the first place, you are permanently safe, the Karen Stitt case should disabuse you of that comfort. The tools available to investigators today are unlike anything that existed a decade ago. The tools that will exist a decade from now are unlike anything that exists today. Biological material doesn't lie and doesn't forget. And the databases grow larger every year, filled with ordinary people simply curious about their heritage, unknowingly strengthening the net that closed around Gary Ramirez in Hawaii in 2022. Karen Stitt deserved better than what happened to her on that September morning. She deserved to grow up, to have decades of ordinary days, to become whoever she was going to become. None of that was restored when Gary Ramirez was convicted in 2025. But something real was restored, the record, the truth, the official, legal, permanent acknowledgement of what happened and who was responsible. In a world where cold cases often end in silence, that matters enormously. She was 15 years old. She was walking to a bus stop. And 40 years later, science and the discipline of investigators who refused to stop working brought the answer her family had been owed since 1982. If this case moved you, if you believe stories like Karen's deserve to be told, hit subscribe right now. Every new subscriber tells us that this work matters and helps us bring more cases like this one to the light where they belong.